Now, obviously, that's the community that they could least afford to alienate, because the people who were attacking the government were largely coming from this community. There were other people. There were Protestant groups that were committing acts of terrorism, but they generally weren't aimed at the government. And so, but if the government was attempting to suppress the political violence directed mostly at them, they were alienating the very communities that would be most helpful for them to resolve this conflict. It's one of the things that we warned about in Into the Fire, was that we were afraid that the United States was on the verge of adopting policies that might have that very effect, that it might alienate Arab and Muslim communities both in the United States and abroad, to a point where we would in fact find ourselves faced with a much more dangerous situation, in that we would see a shift in these communities away from combating terrorism or antipathy toward terrorism to actually thinking that it might be justified, or at least non-cooperation with authorities attempting to ferret it out. And we're currently, in fact, working on an article that is examining just that phenomenon and the shift that has occurred in many Arab and Muslim communities throughout the world. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Room, who's going to discuss a bit more detail about some of our findings.
We looked at Northern Ireland for a lot of reasons, but one of the great things in studying Northern Ireland is how small it actually is. Northern Ireland is a country of 1.5 million people, at least at the time that we were studying it. And that's roughly the size of Philadelphia or Phoenix. But the level of political violence that they experienced during the years of the Troubles was extreme. And so in considering issues such as proportionality, as Professor Fletcher was bringing up, there might be arguments that would justify the use of some of these tactics in a more extreme situation that they faced that would not be present here. Between the years of 1973 and 2001, according to the security forces, there were 269 deaths in Northern Ireland, 35,458 injuries, and 7,613 bombings in Northern Ireland, with a population of 1.5 million people. And that doesn't include the most violent year of the Troubles, which was 1972, where there were more than 10,000 shootings, 1,300 explosions in that year alone. And so in working on Into the Fire, we looked at a host of issues that the Northern Ireland government and the British government imposed in Northern Ireland. But for purposes of our discussion here, we're going to focus on detention and interrogation. What's interesting is that what happened in Northern Ireland in some ways is mirrored by what has happened in the United States with detention and interrogation. The interrogation objective drove detention policies, and detention numbers were driven by the opportunities for interrogation. So it was a circle where they were coming up with policies to facilitate interrogation through detention. And detention in Northern Ireland fell into two broad categories during this time. There was detention under the police powers, and then there was extrajudicial detention, which was internment, which initially was a military detention. Eventually it had some civilian controls put over it. But both proved ineffective and counterproductive in Northern Ireland. In large measure, it was because of the targeting in the use of these tactics. During the peak of internment between 1971 and 1975, there were 1,981 people detained under these powers in Northern Ireland. Of those, 1,874 were Catholic nationalists, only 107 were Protestant loyalists. So the targeting of it undermined the legitimacy of it, and therefore the legitimacy of the system was called into repute. You could argue that if it had shown that these tactics were effective at combating terrorism, that they would be justified and therefore they would validate the use of law. But unfortunately, that's not what our study revealed. There are a lot of different ways you can measure such things as effectiveness. For example, if political violence decreased, then the measures could have been considered to be effective. But that's not what happened in Northern Ireland. In 1971, internment was reintroduced in Northern Ireland. It had been tried earlier in the Troubles, but it was reintroduced in 1971. And what's interesting is if you look at levels of violence in the year before and the year after, what it reveals is this was anything but effective. In 1970, there were 213 shootings and 153 bombings in Northern Ireland. That's 1970. In 1971, internment is reintroduced. The following year, it was the most violent year of the Troubles. There were 1,382 explosions and 10,628 shootings. It's interesting to note that the problem with some of these policies is that even after the country backs off those policies, they have a persistent effect on the legitimacy of the law. And so what happened in Northern Ireland, for example, is that the levels of violence didn't return to the 1970 level of violence until 1985, which was the year of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So another aspect of our article was to look at some of the things that did work, and political involvement and things that enhanced the legitimacy of the rule of law did have a positive effect on levels of violence. Another measure of effectiveness would have been if it had been demonstrated that the people who were detained under these policies were in fact responsible for the political violence. That too is not what occurred in Northern Ireland. For example, most of those detained under the emergency powers were never charged with any terrorist involvement. Little more than 1% of those arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Acts in Northern Ireland were ever charged with those acts. So what you had is a targeting, and then, you know, of those people, only a very small percentage are even charged. Internment, the system of detention with no judicial check on its power, was even more disastrous. The British government reports time and again reported, that they were picking up the wrong people, quite frankly. They'd pick up the wrong bearded guy at house number 7. And that would have the effect that Professor O'Connor was talking about of politicizing people who saw the injustice of it, like Jim McVeigh, the head of the IRA in the Mays prison. If you could say that ineffectiveness were the only downside to this practice of interrogation, if it was a zero-sum game, maybe it wasn't as bad as all that. But unfortunately, that's not what we saw either. It wasn't just that these policies were ineffective, it's that they were counterproductive. According to a British Marine officer, this is a quote in one of the British studies, the British Army has become the object of Catholic animosity. Internment has in fact increased terrorist activity, perhaps boosted IRA recruitment, polarized further Catholic and Protestant communities, and reduced the ranks of the much-needed Catholic moderates. In a worsening situation, it is difficult to imagine solutions. So what they saw was not only that it was ineffective, but that it was having the opposite effect. It was making things worse. That sentiment was resoundingly echoed by the IRA, who said that these tools were the most effective recruiting tools the IRA ever had.